The black Mercedes convoy rolled through the streets of Seoul like a silent storm. 3 vehicles, windows tinted dark as midnight, moving with a kind of precision that made pedestrians step back without knowing why. In the center car sat a man who commanded fear with his presence alone. Park Min-ho was 32 years old, and he controlled an empire built on loyalty, blood, and calculated ruthlessness. The Korean Mafia story that people whispered about in back alleys and corporate boardrooms. He was the living embodiment of it. Sharp suit, sharper mind, and eyes that had seen things most men couldn't survive. But today those eyes held something unusual. Anticipation. Maybe even nervousness. His second-in-command, Jay, sat across from him in respectful silence. He'd worked for Min-ho for 8 years and had never seen his boss like this. Distracted, almost emotional. "We've located her, sir," Jay said quietly. "The address you provided was old, but we found her. She's still in the same neighborhood." Min-ho's jaw tightened. 12 years. 12 years since he'd last seen her face. And her situation. Jay hesitated. "Not good, sir. She's struggling. Working multiple jobs, barely surviving. The same as when I left." Min-ho's voice was flat, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. "Of course. Nothing changes for people like her. The world keeps taking and taking." The car stopped in front of a rundown apartment building. Min-ho stepped out, his expensive shoes touching cracked pavement, his tailored suit incongruous against the poverty surrounding him. Guards materialized from the other vehicles, forming a protective circle. Residents peered from windows, suspicious and curious. Min-ho looked up at the building, memories flooding back like a tidal wave. Somewhere in there was the woman who'd saved his life when he was nothing. When he was worse than nothing, a starving fugitive with a death sentence on his head. An old woman sweeping the entrance froze when she saw him. The power radiating from this man and his entourage was unmistakable. Min-ho approached her with unexpected gentleness. "Excuse me, grandmother. I'm looking for someone. An African girl who lived here 12 years ago. Does she still?" "Amara." The old woman's eyes widened. "You're looking for Amara." The name hit him like a physical blow. Amara. He'd almost forgotten she had a name, having spent years thinking of her simply as the girl who fed me. The girl who'd given him her only food when he was dying in an alley. "Yes," Min-ho said, his voice rougher than intended. "Where is she?" The old woman pointed to a third-floor window. "She's there." "But sir, if you're here to cause trouble." "I'm here to repay a debt," Min-ho interrupted. His eyes never left that window. "A debt 12 years overdue." He gestured to his men. "Wait here. All of you. I go alone." Jay started to protest. "Sir, we haven't cleared the building." "I said alone." Min-ho's tone left no room for argument. "The woman I'm about to see saved my life when I had nothing to offer but gratitude. I won't repay that by bringing fear into her home." As he walked toward the entrance, his mind traveled back through the years. Back to a different version of himself. Back to the night when kindness had changed everything. Back to when he was the one starving in the streets, and she was the only person in the world who'd seen him as human. He paused at her door, his hand raised to knock. For the first time in a decade, the powerful mafia boss felt uncertain. Would she even remember him? Before the story continues, if you enjoy emotional stories about kindness, destiny, and unexpected returns, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 12 years earlier, Amara's life was a carefully balanced act of survival. At 20 years old, she'd been living in Seoul for 3 years, an African immigrant trying to build something from nothing in a country that saw her as perpetually foreign. Her student visa had expired, her scholarship had fallen through, and her family back in Nigeria couldn't help even if they'd wanted to. She was invisible in the way poor people often are, working jobs that paid cash under the table, living in spaces barely suitable for humans, eating when she could afford to and going hungry when she couldn't. But Amara had something that poverty hadn't stolen: dignity and kindness. She worked at a small restaurant in Itaewon during the day, washing dishes for wages that barely covered her shared room in a basement apartment. At night, she cleaned office buildings, moving through glass towers where people earned more in a day than she'd see in a month. The African girl kindness story that would later be whispered in certain circles started simply. Amara helped people. Not because she had extra to give, she never did, but because she couldn't walk past suffering without trying to ease it. She'd share her lunch with homeless people near the restaurant. She'd give her umbrella to strangers in the rain and walk home soaked. She'd slip money to children begging at subway stations, even when it meant she'd skip dinner that night. "Why do you do this?" her roommate, another struggling immigrant, once asked. "You have nothing. You should save everything for yourself." Amara had smiled, tired but genuine. If everyone only thinks of themselves, what kind of world do we have? I may have little, but I'm alive. I'm healthy. That's more than some people have. It was this philosophy that would change 2 lives forever. The night she met the stranger was brutally cold, late January, with wind that cut through her thin jacket like knives. Amara was walking home from her cleaning job at 2 a.m., exhausted and hungry. She'd worked a double shift and missed both lunch and dinner. In her bag was her treasure, a container of rice and kimchi that Mrs. Kim from the restaurant had given her. "You're too thin," the elderly woman had scolded, pressing the warm container into Amara's hands. "Eat this tonight. Promise me." Amara had promised, her stomach already anticipating the meal. She took a shortcut through an alley, a risk, but one she'd calculated against the extra 10 minutes saved. She needed to sleep. She had another shift in 5 hours. That's when she saw him. A man collapsed against a dumpster, barely conscious. Blood on his shirt, face pale as death. Amara's first instinct was to run. This was trouble, obvious, dangerous trouble. Seoul's underbelly was ruthless, and whoever this man was, he'd clearly gotten on the wrong side of something violent. But she couldn't move. Because when the man's eyes fluttered open and met hers, she didn't see a criminal or a threat. She saw her younger brother back home. She saw herself. She saw someone who was going to die alone in an alley if nobody helped. The stranger tried to speak but couldn't. He was shaking, from cold, from blood loss, from whatever hell he'd just escaped. Amara made a choice that would echo through 12 years. She knelt beside him in the filthy alley and opened her bag. Min-ho would remember this moment for the rest of his life with perfect clarity. He'd been running for 3 days, surviving on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate will to live. His father's organization had turned on him after the old man's death, and the succession war had been brutal. Min-ho had barely escaped with his life, wounded and hunted. He'd collapsed in that alley thinking it was over, thinking he'd die like a dog in the garbage, far from the power and wealth his family name had once commanded. Then she appeared. An African girl, young, thin, wearing a cheap jacket and carrying a battered bag. For a moment, Min-ho thought she was a hallucination brought on by blood loss and dehydration. But then she knelt beside him and he smelled food. Real food. Warm food. His stomach, empty for days, cramped painfully. "Are you okay?" she asked in Korean, her accent marking her as foreign but her concern unmistakably genuine. Min-ho tried to answer but managed only a weak shake of his head. The girl, he didn't know her name yet, pulled out a container. Rice and kimchi. Simple, humble food that in that moment looked like a feast from heaven. She didn't ask questions. Didn't demand to know who he was or what had happened. She simply opened the container and held it toward him. "Eat," she said softly. "Please. You need to eat." Min-ho's pride almost made him refuse. He was Park Min-ho, heir to an empire, trained never to show weakness, never to accept charity. But he was also a dying man who'd been shown unexpected mercy. His hands shook as he took the container. He ate like an animal. No dignity, no restraint, just desperate survival. The food was still warm, and each bite felt like life flowing back into his body. The girl watched him without judgment. When he finished, she pulled out a bottle of water, probably the only one she had, and handed it to him. "Drink slowly," she advised. "Your stomach needs time." Minho obeyed. The simple act of being cared for almost more overwhelming than the hunger had been. When was the last time someone had shown him kindness without wanting something in return? When he finally found his voice, it was rough and broken. "Why?" The girl tilted her head. "Why what? Why help me? You don't know me. I could be dangerous." She smiled, tired but genuine. "You could be. But right now you're just someone who needed food, and I had food to give. That's all that matters." "That was your dinner," Minho said, the realization hitting him. The container had been warm, recently prepared. She'd been planning to eat it herself. He shrugged. "I can eat tomorrow. You might not have seen tomorrow without it." Something shifted in Minho's chest. In his world, the world of power, violence, and ruthless ambition, kindness was weakness. Charity was leverage. Nobody gave without expecting return. But this stranger girl had just given him her only meal and asked for nothing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara." "Amara," he repeated, committing it to memory. "Don't tell me," she interrupted gently. "If you're in trouble, it's safer if I don't know. Just be careful, okay? Get somewhere safe." She stood, preparing to leave him with the little strength her food had given him. "Wait," Minho called out. "I need to. I will repay this. Somehow." Amara looked back at him, her expression unreadable in the dim alley light. "You don't owe me anything. Just survive. That's payment enough." But Minho shook his head, even as the movement made his wounds scream. "You don't understand. Where I come from, debts must be repaid. I will remember this. I will remember you. Then remember to be kind to someone else when you can," Amara said. "That's how kindness works. It's not a transaction. It's a cycle." She walked away, leaving Minho alone in the alley with an empty container and a debt he knew he'd carry forever. He didn't know her last name. Didn't know where she lived or worked. He knew only 3 things. Her name was Amara. She'd saved his life. And if he survived what was coming, he would find her again. Minho spent 2 more days hiding in the shadows of Seoul before his loyal supporters found him. His father's organization had fractured completely, with 3 factions vying for control. Minho was the legitimate heir, but legitimacy meant nothing without power. What followed was a brutal month of strategic warfare, not the kind with guns blazing, but the more insidious kind. Alliances forged and broken. Rivals eliminated quietly. Territory reclaimed through intimidation and calculated violence. Minho was ruthless because he had to be. Every moment of mercy could mean death. Every sign of weakness would be exploited. But through it all, he thought of Amara. Of her tired smile. Of her thin jacket inadequate against the cold. Of how she'd given away her dinner to a bloody stranger without hesitation. The contrast between her world and his became starker every day. She lived in poverty, working multiple jobs just to survive, yet she'd shared her only meal. He was fighting for control of an empire worth millions, surrounded by people who wouldn't give him water if he was dying unless they could profit from it. Once he'd secured his position, once he'd won the succession war through a combination of strategic brilliance and necessary brutality, Minho's first thought was to find her. But his advisors counseled patience. "You're not stable yet, sir," his new second-in-command had said. "There are still threats. Still rivals looking for weakness. Wait until you're truly untouchable." Minho hated the advice but recognized its wisdom. He couldn't bring Amara into his world while he was still vulnerable. Couldn't make her a target by association. So he made a different decision. He had his people locate her discreetly. They found her easily enough. Still in the same neighborhood, still struggling, still invisible to a world that didn't value her kindness. Minho wanted to help immediately, but he knew that showing up as he was, wounded, hunted, dangerous, would only bring her trouble. Instead, he made arrangements through intermediaries. Anonymous payments to her landlord covering 3 months' rent. A scholarship that mysteriously appeared for African immigrants, which she qualified for. Small interventions that wouldn't raise suspicion but would ease her burden. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he could do while building his power. Before he left Seoul to establish himself elsewhere, to create the empire that would make him untouchable, Min-ho returned to that alley one last time. He stood where he'd nearly died, where a stranger's kindness had given him one more chance. And he made a promise to the night heir, to himself, to the memory of her tired smile. I will return. When I'm strong enough that no one can hurt you for knowing me. When I can give you everything you deserve. I will come back, Amara. And I will repay what you gave me 1,000 times over. Then he disappeared into the night, beginning a 12-year journey from wounded heir to undisputed king. For Amara, life continued its grinding rhythm. The mysterious assistance she'd received, the rent payments, the small scholarship, had helped for a while. She'd even dared to hope that things were changing, that maybe her luck was finally turning. But good fortune, like everything else in her life, proved temporary. The scholarship ended after 6 months. The rent payments stopped. And Amara was back to the familiar struggle of survival, working multiple jobs and eating 1 meal a day when she was lucky. She thought sometimes about the man in the alley. Wondered if he'd survived. Wondered if he'd found safety, whoever he was running from. She hoped so. The memory of his desperate gratitude, the way he'd promised to remember her, it had felt significant in the moment. But as months became years, Amara accepted that promises made in life-or-death situations rarely materialized into reality. He'd been a stranger who'd needed help. She'd helped him. That was the end of the story. Her life had settled into a pattern of quiet desperation that she'd learned to accept if not embrace. She was 32 now, still in Seoul, still struggling. The dreams she'd had as a younger woman, of education, of building something meaningful, of security, had faded into the background noise of daily survival. She worked at a different restaurant now, still in Itaewon, still cleaned office buildings at night, still shared a basement apartment, though with different roommates as people cycled through poverty's revolving door. The African girl kindness story that defined her hadn't changed. She still helped when she could, still shared what little she had, still couldn't walk past suffering without trying to ease it. You're never going to get ahead if you keep giving everything away, her current roommate, a young Vietnamese woman, often scolded her. Amara would smile, that same tired smile she'd worn for 12 years. Maybe not. But I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that while her life had remained stagnant, the stranger from the alley had been building an empire with her face burned into his memory. Min-ho had spent 12 years consolidating power across 3 countries. He'd transformed his father's fractured organization into a sophisticated network that operated in legal gray areas. Protection services, high-stakes negotiations, information brokering. The Korean Mafia story he represented was one of calculated evolution, moving from street-level violence to boardroom intimidation. He was wealthy beyond measure, feared across continents, commanded absolute loyalty from hundreds of men who would die on his word. But every success felt hollow because he hadn't yet repaid the debt that haunted him. Till now. Until the moment when Min-ho decided he was finally untouchable enough, powerful enough, secure enough to return, to find Amara, to claim his destiny and hers. The knock on Amara's door came at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. She'd just gotten home from her restaurant shift, exhausted and hungry, planning to heat up some leftover rice before heading to her night cleaning job. The knock was unusual. Nobody visited her. Her roommate was at work. Landlords usually just slid notices under the door. Amara opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man standing in the hallway stole her breath. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. His face was aristocratic, handsome in a sharp, dangerous way. His eyes, those eyes, There was something familiar about them, but Amara couldn't place it. This man was clearly wealthy, clearly powerful. He didn't belong in her world. "Can I help you?" she asked in Korean, her accent still present after all these years. The man studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When he spoke, his voice was deep, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of emotion she couldn't identify. "Amara," he said. Not a question. A statement. Her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "Do I know you?" Alarm bells were ringing. How did this stranger know her name? 12 years ago, Minho said slowly. "In an alley not far from here, you gave your dinner to a dying man. Do you remember?" Amara's heart stopped. The stranger. The bloody, desperate man she'd fed. She'd thought about him occasionally over the years, always wondering if he'd survived. But this couldn't be him. That man had been broken, weak, dressed in torn clothes and covered in blood. This man radiated power and wealth. This man commanded fear and respect. That's impossible," she whispered. Minho's lips curved into a small smile, the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "You told me to survive." "I did. Though it took longer than I hoped to return to you." He gestured down the hallway. "May I come in? I have much to tell you. And a debt to repay." Amara's mind was reeling. Part of her wanted to slam the door, to reject this impossible reality. Rich, powerful men didn't show up at the doors of poor immigrant women with good intentions. But those eyes, she remembered them now. Remembered the desperate gratitude, the fierce promise. "If you survive, I will return." He'd kept his promise. Against her better judgment, Amara removed the chain and opened the door. The powerful Mafia boss stepped into her humble apartment, and two worlds that should never have intersected collided in the space of her tiny living room. Minho looked around the cramped apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the single hot plate that served as a kitchen. His jaw tightened. "You're still living like this," he said, and there was anger in his voice. Not at her but at the universe. 12 years, and nothing has changed for you. "Life is expensive," Amara said, defensive despite herself. "I do the best I can." "I know." Minho turned to face her fully. "I know because I've been watching over you from afar, making small interventions when I could. But it's not enough. It will never be enough to repay what you gave me." "I gave you a bowl of rice," Amara said, bewildered. "That's all. Just food." "You gave me my life," Minho corrected, his intensity making her step back. "You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that kindness still existed in this cruel world. Do you have any idea what that meant? What it still means?" Amara didn't know how to respond. This man, this stranger who was somehow familiar, was looking at her like she'd hung the moon. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Really?" Minho's expression grew serious. "My name is Park Minho. I control certain business interests across Korea, Japan, and China. Some legal, some less so. I'm what people politely call a businessman and what others more accurately call a crime lord." He watched her face carefully, waiting for fear or disgust. But Amara had lived in Seoul's underbelly for 12 years. She knew how the world really worked. Knew that power came in many forms, not all of them legitimate. "And you came back because..." "Because I made you a promise," Minho said simply. "Because the debt I owe you has haunted me every day for 12 years. Because you deserve better than this." He gestured at the apartment. "And I finally have the power to give it to you." "I don't need charity," Amara said, lifting her chin with dignity that poverty hadn't stripped away. "It's not charity." Minho's voice was firm. "It's repayment. It's gratitude. It's destiny." He pulled out an envelope and set it on her second-hand table. "Inside is a contract, a position in one of my legitimate businesses. A non-profit that helps immigrant workers. Real job, real salary, benefits, respect. Also, the deed to an apartment. Nothing ostentatious but clean, safe, in a good neighborhood. Yours, no strings attached. Amara stared at the envelope like it might explode. I can't accept this. You can. You will. Minho's tone left no room for argument. But that's not all I'm offering. He stepped closer, and Amara saw something vulnerable flash across his powerful features. I'm offering you a place in my world, under my protection, as someone valued, cherished, protected. The specifics are yours to decide. But you will never struggle again. Never go hungry. Never be invisible. Why? Amara's voice broke. Why does it matter so much to you? Minho was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 12 years of memory. Because in my world, everyone wants something. Everyone has an angle. Everyone will betray you if the price is right. But you gave me your only food and asked for nothing. You saw a dying stranger and chose compassion over self-preservation. That kind of heart is rarer than any treasure I've accumulated. And I refuse to let the world break it. Tears slid down Amara's face. You don't even know me. I know the most important thing about you, Minho said gently. I know you're good. Truly, purely good. And I want to protect that goodness for as long as I live. Amara made tea. A habit of hospitality she couldn't shake even in the presence of a man who probably had servants for such things. Minho accepted the chipped mug with the same respect he'd show fine china, and they sat across from each other in her cramped living room while he told her everything. He spoke of his father's empire, built on violence and fear, of the succession war that had nearly killed him, of crawling through Seoul's underbelly, wounded and hunted, believing death was inevitable. I'd lost everything that night, Minho said, staring into his tea. My father was dead. My allies had turned. My enemies were closing in. I was bleeding out in an alley, thinking about how pathetic it was to die like that after everything. But you didn't die, Amara said softly. Because of you. Minho looked up, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. Your food gave me strength to keep moving. To find my people. To survive long enough to fight back. But more than that, your kindness reminded me why survival mattered. That there was still goodness worth protecting in this world. He described the brutal month that followed. The alliances he'd forged, the enemies he'd eliminated, the empire he'd rebuilt from ashes. He didn't soften the violence, didn't pretend he was anything other than what he was. I'm not a good man, Minho said bluntly. I've hurt people. Killed people who threatened what I was building. I operate outside the law when it suits me. I'm exactly the kind of person you should probably fear. But, Amara prompted because she could hear the unspoken word. But I have a code. I protect those who show me loyalty. I never harm innocents. And I never, ever forget a debt. His gaze intensified. You saved my life expecting nothing in return. That makes you untouchable in my world. Sacred. And I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never suffer again. Amara processed this slowly. The rent payments. The scholarship. That was you. Minho nodded. Small interventions through intermediaries. I wanted to do more, but I couldn't risk drawing attention to you while I was still vulnerable. Couldn't make you a target by association. And now I'm untouchable. Anyone who threatens you threatens me. And no one in their right mind threatens me. It should have sounded arrogant, but it was simply fact. Amara could see the power radiating from him, the absolute confidence of a man who'd conquered his world. This is insane, she whispered. Destiny often is, Minho replied. I fed you one meal. That's not destiny, that's just being human. In my world, being human is revolutionary. Minho leaned forward. Do you know how many people walked past me that night? Dozens. Maybe hundreds. You were the only one who stopped. The only one who saw a person instead of a problem. They were probably scared. They were indifferent, Minho corrected. There's a difference. Fear I understand. But you weren't afraid. You saw someone suffering and chose to help despite having so little yourself. That's not normal, Amara. That's extraordinary. Amara didn't feel extraordinary. She felt like a poor immigrant who'd made a simple choice and somehow ended up in a story that belonged in movies, not real life. I don't fit in your world, she said quietly. I'm nobody. I have no education, no connections, no. You have something far more valuable, Minho interrupted. You have integrity, compassion, the courage to help strangers. Those qualities are priceless. Everything else can be taught, provided, arranged. He stood, straightening his expensive suit. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. Take time. Think about what I've offered. But understand this, whether you accept my help or not, you're under my protection now. Forever. That's not negotiable. You can't just. I can. It's done. Minho's tone was absolute. You can refuse the job, the apartment, everything. But you cannot refuse my protection. That's my choice, not yours. My debt, my responsibility. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. 12 years ago, you told me that kindness isn't a transaction, it's a cycle. You were right. But you were also wrong about one thing. What? You said I didn't owe you anything. But I do. I owe you everything. And I always repay my debts. Amara didn't sleep that night. She sat in her cramped apartment, staring at the envelope Minho had left, trying to process the impossible conversation that had just occurred. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as a fever dream. Rich men didn't show up to repay decade-old kindnesses. Mafia kings didn't care about poor immigrants. But the envelope was real. The business card with Minho's private number was real. The weight of his promise hung in the air like destiny itself. She thought about her mother back in Nigeria, who'd taught her that kindness was its own reward. Thought about all the years of struggle, of being invisible, of wondering if anyone cared that she existed. And she thought about Minho's eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was precious, valuable, worth protecting. Terrified her. But it also awakened something she'd long buried, hope. At 6 a.m., she called the number on the card. Minho answered on the first ring. Amara. Just her name, but the way he said it, like he'd been waiting by the phone all night, made her heart skip. I want to see the apartment, she said. I'll send a car in 30 minutes. I can take the subway. 30 minutes, Minho repeated gently. Please. Let me do this. The car was exactly as promised. Not one of the intimidating black Mercedes, but a modest sedan that wouldn't draw attention. The driver was polite, professional, and blessedly quiet. The apartment was in Gangnam, a neighborhood Amara had only passed through on her way to cleaning jobs. She'd never imagined living there. Minho was waiting outside the building. In daylight, he looked even more powerful, and younger than she'd realized. There was silver at his temples, lines around his eyes, but he couldn't be more than mid-30s. This way, he said, guiding her inside. The apartment took her breath away. It wasn't a mansion. Minho had been truthful about not being ostentatious. But it was clean, modern, safe. 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, windows that let in actual sunlight. Amara walked through it in a daze, touching walls that didn't have water stains, opening cabinets that weren't falling off hinges. The lease is in your name, Minho said from the doorway. Paid for 5 years. After that, we can discuss whether you want to buy or continue renting. Your choice. This is too much, Amara whispered. It's not even close to enough. Minho's voice was firm. But it's a start. Amara turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd reappeared in her life, she really looked at him. Not as a stranger or a threat, but as a man who'd kept a promise across 12 years. Who'd remembered her when he had every reason to forget. Why me? She asked. Really? You could help anyone. Why does it have to be me? Minho crossed the apartment, stopping a respectful distance away. Because when I was at my lowest, when I was nothing, you saw me. Not as a threat or a burden or an opportunity. Just as a human being who needed help. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know what it meant to me? I was just being yourself, Minho finished. being good. And that goodness saved me in more ways than you know. It reminded me that the world wasn't entirely corrupt, that there were still people worth protecting, worth fighting for. His eyes held hers. I rebuilt my empire with your face in my mind. Every time I had to make a hard choice, I thought, what would she do? How would she want me to use this power? You became my compass, Amara. My reminder of why power should be used to protect, not just destroy. Tears slid down Amara's face. I'm not that special. You are to me. Minho's voice dropped. And I'm asking you, not as a mafia king, not as someone you owe anything, just as a man who's carried a debt for 12 years. Let me help you. Let me give you the life you deserve. Let me protect the goodness that saved me. Amara looked around the apartment. Thought about 12 years of struggle. Thought about the tired, poor girl she'd been and the tired, still poor woman she was. Thought about the choice Minho was offering. Accept his help and transform her life, or maintain her pride and continue suffering. But it wasn't about pride, she realized. It was about trust. Could she trust this powerful, dangerous man? Could she trust that his intentions were genuine, that he wasn't trying to control or own her? She looked into his eyes and saw the answer. He wasn't offering to buy her. He was offering to repay a debt, to honor a kindness that had changed his life. Okay, she said quietly. I'll accept your help. The job, the apartment, all of it. Minho's expression transformed. Relief, joy, gratitude all flickering across his usually controlled features. Thank you. But I have conditions, Amara continued. Name them. I work for what I receive. The job has to be real, not charity disguised as employment. I want to earn my place. Agreed. And I keep my independence. I make my own choices. I'm not your... whatever people in your world call women they protect. Your family, Minho said firmly. Nothing less, nothing more. Unless you choose otherwise. But that's entirely your decision. Amara nodded slowly. And the protection. That's really non-negotiable. Completely non-negotiable. You're mine to protect now. That's not ownership, it's responsibility. Anyone who wants to hurt you has to go through me. And no one goes through me. There was steel in his voice, a promise of violence for anyone who threatened her. It should have scared Amara. Instead, for the first time in 12 years, she felt safe. Then we have a deal, she said. Minho smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. Thank you, Amara, for saving my life, for giving me a second chance, for letting me repay what you gave me. Thank you for remembering me, Amara replied, for keeping your promise, for seeing me when the rest of the world looked away. They stood in the sunlit apartment, the poor girl and the Mafia king, their lives intertwined by one act of kindness 12 years ago. Destiny, Minho had called it. Looking at him now, Amara thought he might be right. 3 years later, Amara stood in the lobby of the Park Foundation, a non-profit she now ran, dedicated to helping immigrant workers navigate Seoul's complex systems. She wore professional clothes that fit properly. She lived in that Gangnam apartment, which had become home. She had a salary that allowed her not just to survive, but to thrive. And more importantly, she had purpose. Every day, she helped people like she'd once been. Invisible, struggling, overlooked. She provided legal aid, language classes, job training, housing assistance. She gave them what Minho had given her. A chance. Minho visited often, always respectful, always interested in the foundation's work. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could quite define. Not romance, though there was affection. Not friendship, though there was genuine care. Something deeper than both, rooted in shared history and mutual respect. You've helped over 3,000 people this year, Minho observed, reviewing the annual report with pride. That's extraordinary. We've helped them, Amara corrected. None of this exists without you. It exists because of you, Minho countered. I provided resources. You provided vision, heart, dedication. You took my desire to repay a debt and transformed it into something that helps thousands. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen increasingly often. Warmth, admiration, something tender that neither of them had named yet. Do you ever regret it? He asked. That night in the alley. The choice that changed everything. Amara thought about the scared, hungry girl she'd been. About the simple decision to share her only meal with a dying stranger. Never, she said. It taught me that kindness matters. That one choice can change not just one life but thousands. How could I regret that? And us. Do you regret letting me back into your life? Amara smiled. No longer tired, no longer defeated, but genuine and bright. You gave me purpose. Security. The ability to help people the way someone once helped me. How could I regret that either? Minho stepped closer, and for the first time in their 3-year reunion, he reached out and took her hand. I told you once that you were my compass, he said quietly. That's still true. You make me want to be better. To use my power for more than just survival and dominance. You remind me why any of it matters. And you showed me that kindness isn't wasted, Amara replied, squeezing his hand. That sometimes it comes back to you in ways you never imagined. They stood together in the foundation's lobby, surrounded by the results of their unlikely partnership. Lives changed, families helped, hope restored. Where is the girl who fed me? Minho had asked 3 years ago, searching for a debt to repay. He'd found her. And in finding her, he'd found redemption. Amara had fed a starving stranger expecting nothing. And years later, he'd returned as a king to give her everything. Not because she'd asked, not because she'd demanded, but because kindness, when given freely, creates ripples that echo through years. Because debt repaid becomes destiny fulfilled. Because sometimes, the universe rewards those who help strangers in the rain. The African girl who'd shared her only meal had changed a Mafia king's life. And the Mafia king had spent 12 years preparing to change hers. In the end, they'd both won. And Seoul was better for it. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more powerful stories about kindness, fate, and unexpected returns. Tell me in the comments, would you have helped the stranger too? Have you ever shown kindness that came back to you in unexpected ways? Thank you for watching. Remember, your kindness matters even when you think no one notices. Someone always remembers.